So we were successfully able to create a Windows VM, and I showed you can remote into it and start using it just as you would a Windows machine for the first time. Install whatever workloads you wish up to those limits we talked about earlier. Let's create a Linux virtual machine because the exam requirement does mention being able to create both Microsoft and Linux VMs. You'll find the process to be very similar. So I pick Ubuntu as a version of Linux that I'm familiar with. The latest version, 16.10. I'm going to use the Resource Manager model as the default, so I'll say create. We need to give it a name just like we did for the other one. So I'm going to say Azure 532 Linux Test 1. I'm going to pick the physical hard disk. I'm going to have to create a username. Now, when you're dealing with Linux, you have the additional option for using SSH. Now, you know, if you have any familiarity with Linux, that you can use a lot of operations to connect to a Linux box using SSH for security. Obviously, having a public key and a private key is much more secure than a password. In this particular case, we're not getting into security, and I'm not going to get all through that. We're just going to do the traditional user ID and password route, but obviously you may not choose to do this when you're creating a Linux box for yourself. It'll go under my normal subscription. I'm going to put this in the last one. We created a new resource group. I'm going to actually add this to my existing resource group, and it'll run in ECUS just like the last one did. Now, sizing. It may, I'm going to say view all here. It may surprise you some of the pricing around Linux compared to Windows. You might think that Windows is way, way more expensive than a Linux box, but you can see here there are $500, $600 sized Linux boxes. The cost of Windows does have an impact. Like if I go down to the A0 instance, which is the smallest shared instance, you only get a quarter of a core. It's still $18 a month, which is the same price as a similar sized Windows box. But when you go up to the A4, let's go over here. We can look at the price of Windows for A4 is 60 cents per hour, 61.6 cents per hour. If I change this to Ubuntu and I go to the same machine, A4, it's now only 37 cents per hour. So the cost is not quite half, maybe 30% less, 40% less, but it's still not, still $400 a month for a Linux box. So the cost of Windows has an impact, and maybe it's roughly half, but the cost of the box itself can get expensive. So I'm going to pick the same size, which is A0, $18 a month Canadian. Like we saw, it's 2 cents per hour roughly. So it's going to put this into the virtual network. Here, there's a default network that was created. I could, if I wished, to create a new network, but we'll do that in the networking section. And again, there's going to be IP addresses, network security groups, availability set. We talked about all this for the Windows. Okay, so basically all the same sort of settings that you have for creating Windows. You can review. You can download a template if you wish to save this for future uses. This template is editable. You can open it up on your local machine and go in, and then it becomes scriptable, for instance. But we're just going to accept that, and let's fire off a Linux deployment. So now it is 22 after 1. Let's see. I suspect it's going to be very similar because it has to create the networks, it has to create the storage accounts, it has to create the VMs itself. But let's see if it's going to take 20 minutes.